This podcast is produced by the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do.
One colleague to another. Welcome to Practical for Your Practice. I am Jenna Ermold, one of your hosts, joined by Kevin Holloway. Welcome,
hi, everybody.
Kevin.
Thank you.
And we have Andy Santinello, too, our other host. So we're all three of us together today. Welcome, Andy.
Hey, how's it going, Jenna? Hey, Kevin.
Hey, it's been a while since it's been all three of us.
Yeah, it has been.
Nice to get the band back together.
That's right.
The band's coming back together today. It's kind of Andy's fault. No, it's Andy's. It was one of Andy's ideas. Sometimes we sit around and we talk about what might be great fodder for the podcast. And, Andy's kind of like our interviewee today in some ways, although Kevin and I obviously have some experiences too. But today we're going to talk about spirituality and within the context of providing clinical care. And Andy, this was an idea that you proposed. And I wonder if you could share with our listeners a little bit about why that came up for you and what's your interest in this area, maybe your experiences.
Yeah, it was a topic that I was thinking about, and it's one that's a bit near and dear to my heart for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons I thought it'd be a good topic for us to talk about is because it's kind of taboo a little bit.
Right.
And it's
we like taboo.
Exactly. We do. We were going to name this podcast Taboo for Your Practice, but the alliteration just wasn't there. And it's also, I think, a really important topic for therapists to be open to chatting about with their clients. I know that it's probably not going to be any surprise to anybody hearing this, but I am partial to acceptance and commitment therapy, and values are a huge part of that. And I think for a lot of folks who do have spirituality and religion as part of their life, values related to their spirituality / religion could be really important to discuss. So I think, at least practically speaking, therapists ought to be open to having those topics be in the room. And I guess the other reason that I am particularly interested in this topic is, and this is not something I don't think I've talked about on the podcast before, but Zen Buddhism is a really big part of my life, has been for a really long time. In addition to my role as a psychologist, in my personal life, I'm actually a lineage teacher in the White Pluma Sangha. So I'm a sensei in Zen Buddhism as well. And so I do a lot of meeting with students and talking about existential issues. And there actually are a fair amount of clients who come to work with me in therapy who do also come from a background of Zen Buddhism and are interested in working with someone who is able to kind of be in both worlds. So more often than not, Zen stuff, spirituality stuff tends to come up in therapy sessions.
And sorry.
Go ahead.
That's really, first of all, I think that's super cool, Andy, and I'm always amazed by you. But the word spirituality, and we already talked about it being taboo, it really covers a lot of ground. I mean, there's a lot of different meanings behind what is spirituality. What do we even mean by spirituality? And I wonder if anybody has thoughts about that, because I think sometimes like Zen Buddhism really fits with spirituality, but what else fits in that label, if you will?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that answer to that question is going to be different for everyone. I know it's a little bit of a cop-out. Even just the idea of spirituality, I think is the term there is a little bit almost too specific, because there are non-theistic religions. Like, for example, right. Zen is non-theistic. It's not atheistic. And I also think atheists, people who, don't ascribe to, or believe in sort of a spiritual world or spiritual beings, also have, a sense of guiding principles that we might lump under spirituality. So, I mean, one of the working definitions I use is really one's kind of philosophy of life, and also maybe a sense of connection with something that is bigger than themselves. Whereas religion might be more of a specific group that you participate in, rituals that you participate in, set of guidelines and beliefs maybe you ascribe to. And so, I mean, that's kind of how I look at those things that might that have some similarities and overlap, maybe might be a little bit different.
I really like that because I think it is inclusive of a lot more things. You know, I think sometimes when the word spirituality gets thrown out there, we often do default to religion or sect or, you know, particular, I don't know, not even like denomination. We're talking about like, you know, so many different types of belief that are all valid and can be very important, very central to any of our clients' lives. So I love that you included, you know, as wide as non-theistic and atheistic and other approaches, I guess, or dimensions of spirituality there.
I think there is definitely a tendency for providers to shy away from, as you said, from discussions about this. Why do you see this as a really critical element to address in the therapeutic relationship, or how can it really enhance or be an important part to assess or talk about in the context of providing therapy?
Well, so like there's a couple of things in there that you asked about that I think are really important. And one of them, I'll just sort of name it and maybe we can come back to it in a minute, is just why might providers be a little bit reluctant to sort of even go there. The second part of the question, though, why is it important? I think it's a good one to chat about. It's important because it's going to be important, really important to some of your clients. So, you know, I think if you're saying no to going there and talking about these things with your clients, it's going to get in the way of you connecting with them. And so I think that's just one of the things we need to keep in mind when we're working with clients and this is a part of their life. You know, it may be really relevant to bring that in. I think the other really important reason, having some level of comfort and, you know, competence and expertise, maybe expertise is too strong of a word, but, you know, comfort and competence in talking about spirituality in the course of psychotherapy is because it's so tied to existential issues, you know, issues of life and death and meaning of life. And I think, you know, working with service members, especially if you're going to be working with folks who maybe have, you know, experienced life and death situations or dealing with trauma related disorders, this is going to come up. And so, you know, like, for example, if you're working with someone and they're recovering from trauma, and they're grappling with what does my life mean now that I've been through this and seen these things, you're gonna bump up against some existential issues. So I think when you're talking about spirituality, often those existential issues are tied to it.
I think in some ways, and I hope this doesn't sound like a throwaway way to look at it either, or a cop out, but it seems to me like one of the most important reasons is because it's important when it's important to your client. Like, you know, there may be some of our clients too that are like, you know what, I don't want to go there. That's not my thing. And that's fine too. But it seems like, especially for clients where that's an important part of their worldview, how they see themselves, how they see their connection with other people and the experiences they're having and the symptoms they're dealing with. Like, it seems like it would be kind of what's the word I'm looking for? But, you know, kind of cutting off a whole segment of very fertile discussion relative to their experience by, you know, assuming we shouldn't go there. And exactly. So it kind of reminds me of something when we first started this episode. You talked a lot about your spirituality and your background there too. And I wonder, you know, there are times I think I've certainly met clinicians that's central to how they introduce themselves to their clients. And, you know, it's a big part of their identity as well. And there's certainly other clinicians that don't go there at all. And perhaps this is related to that question about why clinicians, therapists may not want to go there. But I wonder, if all of us have, different thoughts on when is it appropriate to disclose, or how much is appropriate to disclose about our own background or our own spirituality in the clinical relationship.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head right there with one of the sort of key questions here, which is it does revolve around disclosure. Spirituality and religion are inherently intimate and really personal issues,
Right.
So, I mean, one of the things that I'm not saying this is a rule for people to follow. I think everyone needs to make this kind of choice themselves. But one of the things that I am pretty explicit about in, on my website for my private practice and, places where I, make myself known in the public for the client to come find me to do therapy, is that I mentioned on there that I'm, I have a Buddhist background. I actually talk a lot about how that may or may not be a part of therapy, depending on what the client wants. But I think the main issue here is if you're going to disclose, maybe a good rule of thumb around self-disclosure is you want to make sure it's in the service of supporting the client. So, if I'll often get this question, especially for people who are looking for a Zen therapist. So there aren't a whole lot of Zen ACT therapists out there, by the way.
Which it seems strange. They seem to fit really well.
Yeah, maybe there are. I don't know like many of them, but so I'll get the question, how do you work Zen into your therapy? And the answer I always gives is, it really sort of depends on how relevant that is for you.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to talk about like the precepts, like the Zen ethical principles, and that's relevant to you, we can talk about that. If you have a meditation practice and that's part of, what you're trying to incorporate into your therapy and you think that'd be useful, we can do that. And also we may never talk about it. It really has to do with what's most important to you. But I just one of the things I do up front is, as best as I can, is just let people know that I'm very comfortable talking about those issues if they are things that the client needs to talk about.
I think the flip side too is when to know when you're out of your depths. Like if this is a really important part of someone, we talk about intersectionality and all those sort of components of what make up that person. And let's say there is, their religion is really important to them, and it's not one you've been exposed to or have a lot of, you can obviously talk about their beliefs and spirituality and how that shaped the lens that they look through at you and the world and the treatment and what's going on for them. But sometimes, knowing when to help them access, people from that community that might actually be in a better place to have those conversations. I always get concerned sometimes, like we have to be all knowing about all things, all disorders, all approaches, and that's just impossible. And so I think sometimes it's just, are we supporting them to reconnect with a spiritual leader that's going to be able to help them a little more effectively than we might on this side? And, kind of how do you coordinate, collaborate there too? And it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. Like it's okay sometimes to call in. I would imagine, in my world, like, when I'm not currently in practice, but I remember really leaning on chaplains sometimes when they could provide parts of the person's care that really I wasn't as well positioned to do. And I think it's kind of having open conversations about that too, offering a space to be able to let your client talk about the meaning of their spirituality and potentially their religion. I'm not equating the two, but for some people, that's the vehicle for spirituality, right? Yeah. And it's okay to be the facilitator of that as well, while you're also making sure you're incorporating and valuing those belief systems or wishes of your client, perhaps.
I love the idea of cultivating relationships with chaplains. So there's, first of all, if you have access to a chaplain, they are really amazing people to talk to. Some of my most favorite conversations that I've had around helping other human beings have been with chaplains. I remember it was several years ago now, and I was doing a cognitive processing therapy training. at one of the local hospitals in Maryland. And I didn't realize this, but it was actually requested by their chaplain service. And what they were seeing is a lot of the folks who had serious mental illness, psychotic disorders, who were court mandated for treatment. Basically, that was sort of their sentence. As they became medicated, they started to experience a lot of moral injury because they had, done violent things, for example, while they were experiencing really extreme psychotic symptoms. And we had a really fascinating discussion about the intersection between trauma, mental illness, and spirituality, and what it means to be a good person, having done maybe some things that in another state of mind you would not normally do. So first of all, if you have access to have discussions with a chaplain, please do. But also, I think when there are religions that you are not as maybe that are different from yours, and you don't necessarily know the ins and outs of it, you don't have expertise in those areas. When there's really sort of nuanced questions about the intersection between spirituality, religion, and mental health, those are great times to consult. I remember, working when I was in graduate school at an anxiety disorder clinic, and we specialized at that clinic in OCD, and we got a fair amount of folks from the Orthodox Jewish community. And one of the flavors of OCD is scrupulosity, sort of religious focused compulsions. Right. So we did a lot of consultation with local Jewish communities and had some rabbis on speed dial, to sort of talk through some things. So I think this doesn't have to be something that you should tackle alone. It's great to always consult.
So I've pulled my thoughts together, and in some ways, the discussion right now has been a bit of an answer to a question that I've had, but maybe I can modify it then based on the discussion so far. So my original question was going to be, I've certainly met clinicians that feel like if there's not some kind of overlap between their faith tradition and their client's faith tradition, then talking about spirituality perhaps needs to be a less important thing, so kind of this question of how much does that need to match? Do you need to be of the same general or even more specific faith tradition as somebody else? But perhaps maybe my modified question then for all of us is what are maybe perhaps some of the pros and cons of when there is, a spirituality somewhat match between therapist and client, and maybe some pros and cons of when there's a mismatch? Maybe mismatch is the wrong word, but not as much overlap, perhaps.
I love that question. A story. So, I've had the opportunity to work with, different folks from different religions throughout my career, and there's one particular client I'm thinking of who very different religious background than mine. And, we're the both of us really upfront about how we come from very different places. And one of the cool things about the relationship with that person is because, there was a comfort level between us, and we kind of put spirituality on the table, is we got to sort of geek out and sort of compare and contrast different approaches and philosophies in the service of, and it was really fun because it was this person said it was helpful to them because they could really sort of clarify for themselves and more of, get a fine-tuned understanding of their own spirituality by comparing it with maybe some differences. Yeah. So I think in some situations that can be really useful. I think, obviously if you're working with someone and those differences are really maybe so big that it's hard to sort of get to that geeking out place, then you might decide that collaboratively with your client that you'll touch on those things generally, but maybe some of the questions that they're struggling with, spiritually might be better outsourced and talked with someone who has maybe the expertise, maybe a leader, like a teacher or a leader or something in their community.
I've had the opportunity to work in various different clinical contexts too, and some of them have been, in a way, it made it really easy to work with clients who are of a similar spiritual background to mine. So So I come from a very relatively conservative, relatively, I guess you could call it high demand religion background. And it's interesting. There were times working with clients who had a similar spiritual background that there was almost like an assumption of things they didn't have to say, that, that there was an understanding. And there were times where that was good, but there were also times where that was actually a problem, where I think, they kind of assumed I was on the same page with them about certain things. And I would have to kind of pull back and say, well, let's talk about that. What do you mean by that? And actually, in many ways, take some of the implicit conversation going on and making it explicit. And I found it both to be, a barrier at times, because they would assume we're all thinking the same thing, but also a positive at times for that process of, well, let's really drag this out. Let's kind of open this up and talk about it and see what is similar there, or what is it do you actually mean by that you're assuming I'm thinking the same way. So both, if I wasn't paying attention as well as I could have, and missed at times where it seemed like they were making some assumptions that we were agreeing or assuming the same thing, that could have been an issue. And then there were other times where I felt it was really powerful to kind of pull it out and take it apart and talk about it and really make it explicit as we were going through.
It always, I always will go back to military culture, but I think it's so similar to, just because I was in the Air Force and if I have a client who's in the Air Force sitting across from me, doesn't mean that we, come from, our views are exactly the same, our experiences are the same. And there's so much that shapes that worldview. So I think that's, we're going to shift to some actionable intel shortly, but I think this is an area where ask, don't assume is really important.
Yeah.
Because their specific personal experience in their spiritual domain is what we need to kind of allow space to understand and talk about, and not make assumptions, and really be aware of any assumptions they're making about us as well. Andy, we never really hit, before we move on to actionable intel, is there any other content you wanted to make sure we talked about in terms of why don't providers go there, or what are some barriers to doing a better assessment of this really important, potentially important part of the human in front of you?
I think, in addition to the things that we have already kind of said, I think, providers may also be struggling with and uncertain about their own spirituality and, where they are. And so, that certainly, if you're not feeling sort of grounded and sort of, not sure is not the right word, but like,
spiritually unstable.
Yeah. Right.
In flux.
Yeah. Or if, spirituality and religion just doesn't play a huge part in your life for whatever reason, that could also be sort of like, if you don't feel like you've got it all together there, then maybe you shouldn't talk about it with your clients. So, I think one thing maybe to sort of think about and clarify, just like everything else, is if you're uncomfortable with the topic, then doing some self-examination and seeing if part of that might be you haven't clarified for yourself what role spirituality / religion might play in your life. And if you have clarified it, but feel like maybe that's not okay, or you should have a different view, maybe just working on owning it and accepting that's just sort of where you are. I think it's perfectly reasonable to work with someone who is really spiritual and religious in therapy and have these conversations, while also owning maybe the fact that you aren't, for example. But owning it, I think, is really important.
I love what you said about, very often maybe it's the therapist, the counselor who is maybe unsettled in where they're at. And so I have a bit of an ethics question, maybe for the both of you. I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this. Andy, you said at the beginning that you make no secret about your Zen Buddhist, background tradition where you're at right now. And at times that, in some ways, it sounds like it might attract a certain portion of your clientele because they feel like a connection there, or that there's some common ground there. And they feel like maybe in that context to be understood even at a deeper level. And so I'll disclose here, I'm a little bit in one of those unstable or influx, kind of in transition phases of life, kind of in a spiritual or faith transition. And it's interesting because, I have at times too, not explicitly said, hey, if you're of my similar spiritual, background, you should come see me, but have made no secret about what that background is. And so as I find myself a little bit in a transition, I wonder, where's the ethical point that I should be disclosing this to clients who perhaps came with the expectation that I'm, of a similar spiritual background to them. And we do share the background and the lingo, the vocabulary, right? The whole kind of the structural thing. Like I understand that at a pretty good level. And, so there's that. We can speak at that level, but at the same time too, like how much do they deserve to know where I'm at as far as, my own spirituality?
I love that question.
That's a doozy, Kevin.
Yeah.
No, just we're getting deep into the episode. Huh?
Well, and these are the types of things that come up when you get into this area. And I think this is like another kind of reason maybe some clinicians might be a little wary to go there.
Yeah.
But first of all, Kevin, transitions like this, I know, like when I've been through them, can be really hard. And also really sort of, vital and interesting. And so I'm glad that you put that on the table. And I think my answer to your question specifically is, do you think clients who are going through something similar might benefit from knowing that they aren't the only person on earth who's going through something like that?
That's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking of a couple of clients in particular. So I have a small private practice as well. And, I can think of a couple of clients who are having a similar, well, not exactly the same, but, they're in also a transition phase. And we have talked about that really briefly. I find myself, and maybe this is what some of our listeners who have found themselves in similar situations feel as well. Like I find myself like, I want to disclose to support them, but I also get really kind of iffy, like, okay, at what point does it become about me? Like, I don't want the therapy to become about me. Right. I want it to be about them. And so that, figuring out where that threshold is can be a little weird sometimes.
I feel like spirituality is something that does, for most people, wax and wane is the wrong phrase, but there are times where you feel really more intensely spiritual, and then times where you feel more distant from it. And I don't really know if there's many people out there in the world who don't have that experience, right? That there are situations in life or, certain ages or things that you're going through that bring you closer or challenge that aspect of who you are and how you see the world. So I think setting forth that is an expectation. It makes sense to me. We as humans all can have this experience of this being more, more important, less important. We feel closer and more connected and farther apart. And my job is to figure out where you are and where you want to be, and in that journey. And I think we don't have to necessarily disclose exactly. Because like you said, Kevin, I do think it can be comforting and helpful for people to, and again, I'm going back to the military. This is sometimes why, service members will say, I want to see somebody who already understands my world and my language. And we don't have to have the exact same views on the military for me to help you, but you don't have to explain every aspect of it to me the way you might somebody else. And I think that's very similar with spirituality as well. I don't want to spend my time explaining to you where I am in my spiritual realm. I want you to kind of, if there's some shortcuts that I can get to more important stuff because you understand the language, there's maybe that sense. So, I mean, that was a non-answer to your question, but I think we don't have to disclose exactly where we are personally, because then it does, I think, become about us, but we can normalize that it makes sense that there is, that experience is very human and crosses all sorts of religious domains and, spiritual experiences, and that's okay. But, my focus is you and where you are and where you want to be, maybe.
I really like that for a couple of reasons. I think the metaphor works well because, I think all of us here have probably seen clients too that are service members or veterans. And I don't want to see somebody who is in the military because of maybe fears about being judged by a perceived, a set of metrics, if you will, of what makes a good service member or a veteran. And similarly, I can also think of a few clients that are like, okay, but I don't want to see somebody who's similar to me because then I would feel like I have to somehow measure up. I'm thinking specifically of myself. Like, I've been in counseling before with a counselor who actually had, was kind of the same faith background as I was, had gone through a faith transition themselves a few years before. And it was, in some ways, it was kind of nice to be like, oh, not only can we share the vocabulary, but I also don't have to feel like there's going to be like, really, that's what you're dealing with,
Yeah,
And so that was, it was kind of like best of both worlds. And she didn't, she was fantastic. She didn't go into, a huge depth of her background to the point where I was like, wait, is this about me or you anymore? It was really appropriate, but also really supportive and comforting, knowing that we could share this communication and there wasn't, any external judgment going on. Not that I would expect, a therapist, a good therapist, good counselor to do that anyway, but I've kind of had that experience of feeling like this was the right mix, if you will.
The line between ethical disclosure and maybe like borderline non-ethical around this issue might be something like, client says, I'm going through this difficult transition period. You might say something like, I can appreciate where you're coming from. I've certainly been through that and things like that in my life, versus I'm going through this thing right now. I'm glad you said that, because I'm going through this thing right now. And I wanted to ask your opinion about it. And right. One is normalizing and supporting the client and letting them know this is like a safe place to talk about this. And they're speaking to another human being who kind of gets maybe that space a bit. And the other is, clearly, hey, here's an opportunity for me to talk about something I'm struggling with my client. Let me go there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for indulging me on my ethics question. I think that's one traveled in my head, and I think a lot of people do. Yeah.
Clearly hit all of us, so it's relevant. Just being aware of I have a feeling this is one of those episodes that we could do for hours. But so, being aware of the time, I did want to shift us a little bit to actionable intel, which of course is what are some concrete, maybe practical tips or things that providers can do to think about this, aspect of the care they give, or, ways to grow in this area. And Andy wondered if you had any actionable intel and I think resources. Again, we often get great questions. We have a lot of interview questions about all sorts of things. And sometimes, I wonder if there is a good guide or, anything we can link to that has some good to ask questions when it comes to spirituality. And I might be setting you up, there might not be, but I'm going to include before I turn it over for actual intel, the mental health and chaplaincy through the VA has a program where they really try to integrate those two things. I'm going to link some nice videos about why bridging that gap's important, and some content about that program, because I think that can be a great resource. In general. But what can providers do to shore up this part of their practice, Andy?
I think one thing that's a pretty easy thing to do is to start, including maybe a question in your intake process about spirituality. And a really nice place I think to put it would be when you're talking about how a person takes care of their health. So, usually we focus on physical health, but also, we talk about psychological health. Well, spiritual health could be part of it too. Another place could be when you're asking people about the important relationships in their life or things they do outside of work, just slipping in there, how important is spirituality to you? How important is religion to you? Might be just a nice way of doing some assessment, but also letting your client know that this is an area that, you're willing to chat with them about. So I think that's one really useful and easy thing for folks to do.
Glad you said that. I was going to throw that in there if it didn't come up. So that feels very validating. We're on a similar page there.
I was just going to say another one would be curiosity. So I think if you're going to be talking with somebody about their spirituality, especially if they're anticipating maybe judgment or misunderstanding, is if you can come into that conversation really curious, I think it's going to go better. And, if you do find that you're a bit out of your depth, being able to come to that discussion from a place of curiosity and, honesty, and being able to let your client know your level of competence is in that situation, and talking about their particular concerns, I think is going to be really important. So also, making sure that you're able to be upfront with them about what it is that you think you're able to help them with, and when it might be best for them to seek out and then maybe facilitate them seeking out someone from the religious community to answer some of the questions they might have.
I love that. I love especially the curiosity there. I think, like Jenna mentioned earlier, when we talk about military culture, one of the things we hammer home all the time is don't ask, don't assume, that it's okay not to be an expert on all things military culture. And I think in some ways, it's another way that these are parallel things, that when it comes to spirituality, it's really okay not to be an expert on all things spirituality, and that it's okay to ask questions. Some of the best experiences I've had is when I've asked clients to kind of teach me a little bit, inform me a little bit, tell me more about what that means to you and how you understand that. And I don't, at least in my experience, clients haven't been offended by that. They like to, they like to be able to talk a little bit more about how they see that, how they see themselves in spirituality and how they're connected to that, rather than me making assumptions anyway. So, I think we right along with that curiosity, feel free, make it okay to ask, don't assume.
I guess maybe one last thing I would mention, and Jenna reminded me, I mentioned this earlier, is, consultation is really important. Mm-hmm. So if you do have access to, if you're working in a military setting and you do have access to military chaplains, ask them out for coffee. The worst that's going to happen is you're going to have a really great conversation with somebody who is going to probably be more comfortable talking about meaning of life issues than the ordinary bear. So you may find also that person is a really good resource for you and your clients going forward. And
at least a great conversation.
Yeah, and at least a great conversation. Always good to have new contacts.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would encourage folks to think about that in their communities too. Don't wait until you're in a crisis and need it. Try and figure out what could be some great resources that you could build relationships with, so that if you need to consult, you can. Well, I certainly enjoyed our fabulous conversation. I think those are all wonderful ideas in terms of actionable intel. If we think of any great links, we'll make sure to add them in the show notes. So thank you for sitting down today, Andy and Kevin. And,
of course.
Inviting in a conversation about spirituality into Practical for Your Practice podcast. And we hope you all enjoyed listening and that you'll circle back for our next podcast. But for today, we'll just say thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Practical for Your Practice.
Please feel free to subscribe, rate, and join in on the conversation in the comments.
Until next time.